My name is Ethan Caldwell, I'm 31 years old, and until recently I genuinely believed I had a stable, if slightly boring, marriage. From the outside, Lauren and I looked perfectly fine. For years married, no kids yet, decent jobs, a clean 2-bedroom apartment in Plano, Texas, and predictable routines that felt safe. I worked in hybrid IT consulting, mostly remote, but a couple of times a week I'd drive into the shared workspace we used in downtown Dallas just to avoid going stir-crazy. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and it gave us stability. I thought stability was a good thing. Lauren is 29 and works in digital branding. When we first met, I admired how driven she was, how she could dissect trends and aesthetics like they were second nature. Over time, though, that professional obsession with image stopped being just about her job and started bleeding into everything. The apartment wasn't just an apartment anymore, it was a reflection of status. Our car wasn't transportation, it was a statement. Even the restaurants we chose felt like marketing decisions instead of personal preferences. I noticed the shift slowly, like watching a tide come in without realizing how far the water had moved. Her younger sister, Madison, didn't help. Madison lived in uptown Dallas in one of those glass high-rises with a rooftop pool and floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind you see in real estate ads with captions about curated lifestyles. I knew she couldn't realistically afford it. She hopped between credit cards, made minimum payments, and acted like financial anxiety was just part of being young and fabulous. Whenever Lauren visited her, she'd come back different. More restless. More critical. Madison constantly fed her this narrative that our quiet suburban life was some kind of trap, that Plano was where ambition went to die, that Lauren was wasting her 20s playing house instead of building an empire. Over the last year, I felt Lauren pulling away from me in ways that were subtle at first but eventually impossible to ignore. She started mocking the apartment, calling it beige and lifeless, even though she had picked half the furniture herself. She compared me to husbands of her friends who were building startups or closing 6-figure deals, like my steady income and normal hours were somehow embarrassing. When I suggested simple weekend trips or dinner dates at places we used to love, she'd roll her eyes and ask if we could at least try somewhere that felt upscale. I told myself she was just going through something, that maybe she felt stuck, that maybe I needed to step up. So I worked harder. I took on extra projects. I started cleaning more, cooking more, trying to surprise her with spontaneous plans that fit the aesthetic she seemed to crave. I upgraded little things around the apartment, bought better wine, even started dressing sharper when I went downtown, as if looking more polished would somehow translate into being more worthy. Every time she seemed unimpressed, I pushed myself further, convincing myself that marriage required effort and that this was just my turn to carry the weight. Looking back now, I can see how wrong I was about the nature of that effort. I wasn't fighting for my marriage in a mutual sense. I wasn't addressing a problem together with my wife. I was performing. I was adjusting, improving, reshaping myself to fit an invisible checklist that kept expanding. Every compliment I tried to earn felt conditional. Every small moment of approval felt like a passing grade. I thought I was being a good husband by trying harder. In reality, I was auditioning to keep my own wife interested, and I didn't even realize the role I was competing for had already started slipping away from me. The week before Lauren turned 30, she mentioned casually over breakfast that she was going to celebrate with Madison at some rooftop wine event in Uptown, the kind with string lights, curated charcuterie boards, and a photographer wandering around capturing candid shots for social media. She didn't even look up from her phone when she said it, just added that I probably wouldn't enjoy it anyway. She said it lightly, like it was a practical observation, but it landed heavier than she realized. It wasn't just that she assumed I wouldn't like it, it was that she didn't want me there. I nodded and pretended to agree, like I understood, like I fit neatly into the role she'd quietly assigned me. But that comment sat with me all week. 30 felt significant. I knew how much milestones meant to her, how much she cared about marking them in a way that looked intentional and impressive. I told myself that if I could just get this right, if I could create something thoughtful and elevated enough, maybe she'd see me differently again. So instead of arguing or insisting on coming along, I said I had client meetings Friday evening and probably wouldn't make it. She barely reacted, just said okay and went back to planning outfits with Madison. In reality, I took the entire Friday off. I drove down to the Bishop Arts District earlier that afternoon and picked up a custom cake I had ordered from the boutique bakery she loved, the one she always posted about because of their minimalist designs and perfect lighting. I had spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing the flavor, finally settling on the pistachio-raspberry combination she once said tasted expensive. I made a reservation at an upscale steakhouse downtown that I knew she'd been wanting to try but said was too indulgent for a random weekend. I even packed her favorite navy dress and the heels she always said made her feel powerful, carefully laying them in the trunk so they wouldn't wrinkle. In my head, I imagined pulling up, surprising her, and whisking her away from the rooftop party to something even better, something that showed I could play the game too. That night, Dallas decided to unravel. The weather alert came through just as I was finishing up at home, warning of severe thunderstorms, flash flooding, and possible road closures across the metroplex. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the radar on my phone as red and purple swirls crept over the map, but I convinced myself it would pass or at least slow down. By the time I left Plano, the rain was already coming down hard enough to blur the highway lights into streaks. What normally took 15 minutes without traffic stretched into something unrecognizable. Water pooled across exit ramps, cars crawled forward with hazard lights blinking, and every underpass looked like a gamble. At one point, driving through what I thought was a shallow stretch near downtown, my sedan sputtered as water splashed higher than I expected. The engine coughed, and for a few terrifying seconds I thought it was done. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I managed to ease forward, praying silently, until the car caught again and kept moving. I should have turned around. Any rational person would have. But all I could think about was showing up, soaked and determined, cake intact in the passenger seat, proving through sheer effort that I wasn't the safe, predictable husband Madison liked to mock. By the time I reached uptown, nearly 3 hours had passed. My clothes were damp from running through sheets of rain, my shoes squelched with every step, and my nerves were frayed from gripping the steering wheel so tightly for so long. I told myself the struggle would make the gesture even more meaningful, that the storm would become part of the story we'd laugh about later. I imagined Lauren's face softening when she saw me, the surprise turning into gratitude, maybe even admiration. Standing there with the cake box in my hands and rainwater dripping from my jacket, I truly believed I was about to prove that I could rise to the occasion, that I could be spontaneous and grand and worth choosing. I didn't realize that what I was actually about to prove had nothing to do with ambition or romance at all. I still had the spare key Madison had given Lauren months ago, back when the sisters were pretending their relationship with each other was open and generous instead of competitive and performative, and I used it without thinking because in my head I was still a husband arriving with a surprise, not an outsider approaching a locked door. The hallway outside her apartment smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and expensive perfume, and I could hear the low hum of music even before I reached the door. I remember adjusting my grip on the cake box, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself to wait for the perfect moment to step in. When I unlocked the door and slipped inside, I did it quietly, almost playfully, like I was setting up the reveal. The living room lights were dim, warm against the storm-dark windows, and I could see the city flashing white every few seconds from lightning in the distance. Their voices carried clearly from the kitchen, bright and loose in that way people sound after a couple glasses of wine. I heard the clink of glass against glass, the soft scrape of a chair across tile, and then laughter, easy and unguarded. Then I heard my name. Madison's voice came first, dripping with a kind of amused disdain I had grown used to but never fully confronted. She said, "He didn't even try to show up?" Classic. The word classic landed like a label, like I was a predictable punchline they both understood without explanation. Lauren laughed in response, and that laugh was what stopped me completely. It wasn't polite or defensive. It wasn't the kind of laugh you give when someone teases your spouse and you feel obligated to soften it. It was genuine. "Honestly," she said, and I could hear the shrug in her tone. "I'm relieved. Sometimes I feel like I can finally breathe when he's not around." I didn't move. I didn't even feel the rainwater dripping from my jacket anymore. My brain tried to reframe it, to twist it into something less sharp, like maybe she meant I stressed her out unintentionally, maybe she was exaggerating for effect. But there was no strain in her voice, no hesitation. She sounded comfortable. Then Madison said something I couldn't fully make out over a burst of thunder, and Lauren responded with the sentence that cut clean through every excuse I had built for her over the past year. "Can you imagine if something happened to him in this storm?" she said, almost thoughtfully, like she was commenting on traffic. "I'd finally be free." They both laughed. It wasn't nervous laughter. It wasn't the awkward kind that follows a dark joke you immediately regret. It was casual, almost lazy, like they were sharing an inside joke about a minor inconvenience. Free. The word echoed in my head in a way the thunder outside couldn't compete with. Free from what? Free from me. I stood there in the entryway, shoes soaked, jacket clinging to my arms, holding a custom cake I had agonized over, listening to my wife describe our marriage as something she needed liberation from. Not a partnership that needed work. Not a rough patch. A cage. That was what I heard between her words. A cage she fantasized about escaping, even if the scenario she imagined involved me getting hurt in a storm I had driven through to celebrate her. My hands felt numb, and for a moment I was afraid I would drop the cake. The box had grown soft at the edges from the rain, and I stared at it like it was evidence of my own stupidity. Every extra project I had taken on, every dinner I had planned, every small adjustment I made to become more impressive, all of it replayed in my mind in the span of a few seconds. I thought about my car stalling in floodwater and how I had kept going anyway because I wanted to prove I wasn't boring, that I wasn't predictable, that I was worth the effort. Inside that kitchen, they were still talking, their voices blending with the storm, but I couldn't make out the words anymore because my ears were ringing. The only thing that remained clear was that sentence. I'd finally be free. Not said in anger. Not in the heat of a fight. Said comfortably, over wine, with her sister, as if it was a quiet truth she had already accepted. In that moment, soaked and silent in someone else's apartment, I understood something with painful clarity. I had been exhausting myself trying to earn a place in a life where my absence was being fantasized about as relief. I don't remember deciding not to walk into that kitchen, it was more like my body made the choice before my pride could interfere, because the version of me that would have demanded answers, that would have slammed the cake down and forced them to look at me, suddenly felt small and exhausted, and I realized that no confrontation was going to undo what I had just heard. You cannot unhear someone describing your absence as freedom. You cannot argue someone into wanting you. My shoes were quiet against Madison's polished floor as I stepped forward just enough to reach the edge of the kitchen counter without fully entering their line of sight, and I placed the cake down carefully, almost gently, as if it still mattered that it didn't tip over. The box left a faint wet mark on the stone from the rainwater dripping off my sleeves. For a split second I considered opening it, letting them see what I had brought, forcing the symbolism of it into the room, but that felt theatrical, and I was suddenly too tired for theater. I had spent a year performing already. They were still laughing about something unrelated, completely unaware that I had been standing there, that I had heard every word, that the storm outside had nothing on the one that had just settled inside my chest. I turned around the same way I had entered, quietly, deliberately, and walked back toward the door. My hand didn't shake when I unlocked it. I closed it behind me without a sound. The hallway felt colder than before. The rain had eased slightly, but the streets were still slick and reflecting the city lights in fractured patterns. I got into my car, which smelled faintly of damp fabric and sugar from the cake that was no longer there, and just sat for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. I expected to feel anger rising, some explosive urge to turn back, but what I felt instead was a strange, hollow calm. The drive toward Love Field was quieter than the one that had brought me there. The roads had thinned out, and I barely registered the traffic lights changing from red to green. I pulled into a Holiday Inn near the airport because it was the first place I saw with vacancy lights on, and I didn't want to think about options. The lobby was brightly lit in that generic, almost clinical way chain hotels are, and the woman at the front desk didn't look at me twice as she handed over a key card. I must have looked like any other exhausted traveler stranded by bad weather. In a way, I was. Inside the room, I dropped my wallet and keys on the small desk and sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing damp clothes. My phone began buzzing almost immediately. I had forgotten that I'd told Lauren I had meetings. Maybe she had checked my location. Maybe she had finally noticed the cake on the counter. The vibrations came in waves, one after another, persistent and insistent, lighting up the darkened room. I didn't pick it up. I didn't read a single message. After a few minutes, I powered it off completely and set it face down on the nightstand. I lay back and stared at the ceiling for hours. The air conditioner hummed softly, and every so often I could hear a plane descending toward the runway, the distant roar fading into silence. My mind replayed the sentence over and over, not dramatically, not with fresh pain each time, but like a fact being filed into place. I'd finally be free. It wasn't the storm comment that haunted me, it was the relief in her voice earlier, the way she said she could finally breathe when I wasn't around. I had spent months trying to become less suffocating without realizing she saw my presence itself as the problem. Sometime near dawn, after a night without sleep, something shifted inside me. It wasn't rage. I didn't feel the urge to retaliate or expose her words. It wasn't even heartbreak in the dramatic sense I would have expected. It was clarity, sharp and steady. If my existence felt like imprisonment to her, then the kindest and most self-respecting thing I could do was remove myself from the equation. Completely. Not as a threat. Not as a tactic. Just as a fact. I understood then that arguments would only turn her quiet resentment into open hostility. Drama would only confirm whatever narrative Madison had already built about me being controlling or insecure. I didn't want to beg someone to see value in me. I didn't want to fight to stay somewhere I was being quietly wished away from. So as the first gray light of morning crept through the thin hotel curtains, I made a decision that felt almost peaceful in its simplicity. No confrontation. No scene. No drawn-out debate about who said what and why. Just absence. If freedom was what she wanted, I would give it to her in the most literal way possible. The next 72 hours unfolded with a precision I didn't know I was capable of, as if once the emotional fog lifted my mind defaulted to strategy instead of sentiment. I moved through each step quietly, deliberately, the same way I had walked out of Madison's apartment, except this time there was no shock, only intention. I turned my phone back on late that morning in the hotel room, not to respond to Lauren, but to gather information. The missed calls and messages stacked up exactly the way I expected, a mixture of confusion and irritation judging by the preview notifications, but I didn't open them. I had nothing to clarify. The first thing I did was open a separate bank account in my name only. I sat in the branch office with a calm expression while a young banker explained account options, and I nodded like this was a routine financial decision instead of the quiet dismantling of a marriage. Half of our joint savings were legally mine, money I had contributed consistently over 4 years, and I transferred that portion without drama, without leaving a note in the memo line, just a clean digital shift from one account to another. I wasn't trying to punish her financially. I was securing stability for myself, something I should have done emotionally a long time ago. From there, I searched for a furnished apartment in Richardson, far enough from Plano to feel separate but close enough to my work routines that nothing else in my life had to collapse with the marriage. I signed a short-term lease on a modest one-bedroom unit that came with neutral furniture and blank walls, a space that didn't carry shared memories. The leasing agent congratulated me on the quick turnaround like I was relocating for an exciting job opportunity. In a way, I was relocating for clarity. That afternoon, I scheduled a consultation with a family attorney who specialized in separation laws in Texas. Sitting across from him in a quiet office, I laid out the basics in measured tones, avoiding emotional language, focusing instead on timelines, assets, and procedural requirements. He spoke about community property, residency requirements, and the practical steps toward formal separation. I took notes. I asked about documentation. I treated it like another project to manage efficiently. When I returned to the apartment in Plano, Lauren was at work. The place looked the same as it had days earlier, tidy and curated, framed wedding photos on the hallway wall, decorative accents she once insisted were essential to creating the right atmosphere. I walked through each room without rushing. I packed essentials only, clothes, important documents, my laptop, a few personal items that actually meant something to me. I left the rest behind deliberately. The wedding album stayed on the shelf. The couch we had debated over for weeks stayed exactly where it was. The carefully arranged decorations she once claimed she loved remained untouched. If she felt suffocated by my presence, then she could sit in the aesthetic she curated without me in it. Before I left, I allowed myself one small act of pettiness, not out of rage but out of symbolism. I logged into the router settings and changed the Wi-Fi password to Growth 2025. It felt like a quiet statement, one she would have to type in letter by letter if she wanted connection again. Then I opened the living room drawer, removed the batteries from the TV remote, and slipped them into my pocket. Petty, absolutely, and I knew it. But those tiny inconveniences represented all the invisible maintenance I had handled for years, the subscriptions managed, the bills tracked, the passwords reset, the small frustrations smoothed over before she ever noticed them. This time, she would notice. I took one last look around. Not with nostalgia but with assessment, making sure I had everything I needed. I locked the door behind me and didn't leave a note on the counter. I didn't owe her a dramatic explanation. By the time she would realize what was happening, the logistics would already be in motion. Once I settled into the new apartment, I blocked her number. No farewell message. No final paragraph about how I felt. Silence replaced argument. The constant hum of trying to prove myself was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar stillness. In that silence, there was space to think, to breathe without measuring my worth against someone else's expectations. Silence became both my boundary and my therapy, a shield against further erosion and a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response is the absence of one. The first 2 weeks passed in a strange, controlled quiet, the kind that feels almost artificial after years of constant background tension, and I focused on work, on setting up my new apartment, on meeting with my attorney again to clarify timelines, and I kept my routine steady because routine was grounding in a way emotion was not. I had blocked Lauren's number the day I moved out, and I ignored the emails that filtered into a separate folder I created specifically so I would not see her name unexpectedly flash across my screen. I knew the silence would eventually provoke a reaction, but I underestimated how quickly it would escalate. One afternoon, as I pulled into the parking garage of the shared workspace in downtown Dallas, I noticed her car parked near the entrance. At first I thought it was coincidence, but when I stepped out of my vehicle, I saw her standing near the glass doors of the building, arms crossed tightly as if she were bracing against cold that wasn't there. She looked smaller somehow, less polished than usual, her hair pulled back carelessly instead of styled. For a split second, instinct told me to walk toward her, to ask what she was doing there, to resolve it like adults. Instead, I got back into my car, reversed slowly, and drove past the building without making eye contact. In my rearview mirror, I saw her take a step forward as if she might run after me, but she didn't. Later that evening, one of her friends texted me, a long message about misunderstandings and pride and how relationships require grace. I read the preview notification and deleted it without opening the full thread. Madison sent her own message shortly after, accusing me of overreacting and abandoning my responsibilities, framing my silence as immaturity rather than consequence. I deleted that too. I wasn't interested in defending myself to someone who had laughed along. A few days after that, my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost ignored it automatically, but something told me to let it go to voicemail instead of declining the call outright. When the notification appeared, I waited several minutes before listening, sitting at my kitchen counter in the quiet of my new apartment. Her voice sounded different, stripped of its usual edge. She said she wasn't sleeping, that the apartment felt too quiet now, that she had started therapy because she couldn't stop replaying what she had said that night. She told me that hearing herself repeat the words out loud in a therapist's office made her feel sick, that she hadn't recognized the cruelty in her tone until it was reflected back to her. She insisted it wasn't how she truly felt, that it had been the wine, the atmosphere, her sister's constant commentary feeding into her frustration. She said she felt overwhelmed turning 30, that she had projected her fears onto me. I listened to the entire message without pausing it, without reacting, just absorbing it like data. There was a tremor in her voice at one point, a crack that suggested she might be crying, but even that felt distant, as though I were listening to a recording of someone I used to know rather than my wife. She said she missed me. She said she didn't mean it. But here is what stayed clear in my mind, as steady as it had been in that hotel room near Love Field. Drunk words are not invented. They are revealed. Alcohol does not create thoughts from nothing, it lowers the filter that usually keeps them hidden. The relief in her voice when she said she could breathe without me had not been slurred or hesitant. It had been calm, considered, comfortable. When the voicemail ended, the silence in my apartment returned immediately, heavier than before but not suffocating. I placed the phone face down on the counter and stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of what responding would mean. A call back would reopen negotiation, reopen the audition I had finally walked away from. It would invite explanations, promises, perhaps even temporary change fueled by fear of loss rather than genuine respect. I did not call back. 6 weeks after I walked out of Madison's apartment, logistics forced what emotion had been avoiding, because our lease in Plano was approaching renewal and neither of us could ignore paperwork forever. We agreed to meet in a neutral place, a coffee shop in Addison that sat between our routines like a carefully chosen midpoint. I arrived early and chose a table near the window, not for symbolism but for space, somewhere open enough that nothing would feel cornered. When Lauren walked in, I noticed the changes immediately. She looked thinner, not dramatically but enough that her sweater hung a little looser at the shoulders. Her hair was pulled back simply, no elaborate styling, no attempt at the curated aesthetic she once prioritized. There was no designer bag on her arm, no carefully coordinated outfit that looked like it had been assembled for social media approval. She looked like someone who had been sleeping poorly, someone whose confidence had taken a quiet hit. She sat across from me and exhaled like she had been holding her breath the entire drive. She came prepared, that much was obvious. A small notebook rested on the table between us, pages marked with folded corners and underlined sentences. She spoke calmly at first, outlining practical concerns about the lease, how we could divide the remaining months or negotiate with the landlord. Then her voice shifted, softened, and she opened the notebook. She apologized in structured sentences, as if she had rehearsed them in therapy. She said she understood the damage she had caused. She acknowledged the cruelty of her words and the deeper pattern of disrespect that had built over the past year. She told me she had been in counseling weekly, that she was beginning to unpack her insecurity about turning 30 and her obsession with image and comparison. She proposed couples therapy, a structured plan, accountability, transparency, even limiting contact with Madison if that was necessary. It sounded organized, almost strategic, like she was pitching a recovery plan for a failing company. I listened without interrupting, letting her finish every point she had written down. When she finally closed the notebook, her hands trembled slightly, and she looked at me with an expression that mixed hope and fear. She expected resistance, maybe anger, maybe a cold refusal. What she did not expect was what I said next. I told her that the night I drove through the storm, I had not been alone in the way she thought. On the way to Uptown, my best friend Ryan had called to check in, and I had answered through the car's speaker system because my hands were on the wheel and the rain was blinding. I explained that when I reached Madison's building and parked, I hadn't hung up yet. I had stepped out of the car still connected to him, distracted and focused on the cake and the surprise. When he realized from my silence that something was wrong, when he heard voices and then heard the words clearly enough to understand what was happening, he started recording on his end out of instinct more than calculation. Her expression shifted from confusion to unease as I took my phone out of my pocket and set it on the table between us. I told her I had not listened to it often, only once fully, because once was enough. Then I pressed play. The audio was clear, disturbingly clear. The faint background of clinking glasses, Madison's voice teasing, and then Lauren's laugh, unrestrained and light. I watched her face as her own voice filled the small space between us. When the sentence about finally being free played, it sounded exactly the way it had that night, calm and unbothered. There was no distortion, no dramatic emphasis added by memory. Just the truth captured in real time. The color drained from her face so quickly it was almost clinical. She covered her mouth with one hand as if she could physically stop the sound, but it kept playing until the laughter faded. When I paused the recording, the silence in the coffee shop felt heavier than the noise had been. She shook her head slowly, tears forming in her eyes, and whispered that it sounded worse than she remembered, that hearing it outside her own head made it feel crueler, colder. I told her gently but firmly that memory distortion does not change reality. The recording was not an exaggeration. It was not my interpretation. It was simply what happened. She cried then, not loudly, but with a kind of contained collapse, shoulders tightening inward. I did not reach across the table. I did not comfort her. Compassion and consequence can exist at the same time, and I understood that shielding her from the weight of her own words would only dilute the lesson. When the conversation returned to practical matters, it felt steadier. We agreed to a formal 6-month separation, structured and documented, with no contact except for necessary logistics. Both of us would continue individual therapy. At the end of those 6 months, we would evaluate without pressure or fantasy whether this marriage deserved resurrection or burial. There was no dramatic reconciliation and no explosive ending in that coffee shop. Just two people facing the recorded evidence of a fracture and choosing to step back rather than pretend it had never happened. Those 6 months did not feel dramatic while I was living them, but looking back, they reshaped me in ways I had not anticipated, not because I was trying to transform into someone impressive, but because for the first time in years I was building a life without trying to prove its worth to anyone else. The separation agreement created distance, and in that distance I found something that had been missing long before the rooftop conversation ever happened. I started lifting weights at a small gym near my apartment in Richardson, not out of vanity but because I needed somewhere to put the restless energy that used to be consumed by anxiety. At first I could barely focus, my thoughts wandering between legal paperwork and therapy sessions, but gradually the routine of showing up 3 or 4 times a week became grounding. Strength training gave me measurable progress that did not depend on someone else's approval. The weight either moved or it did not, and when it did, I knew I had earned it. I enrolled in a weekend photography course on a whim after passing a flyer taped to a coffee shop window. I had always liked the idea of capturing moments, but I had dismissed it as impractical before. Walking around with a camera forced me to observe instead of react. I spent early mornings taking photos near White Rock Lake, focusing on light reflecting off the water or runners moving through fog. There was something healing about framing the world intentionally instead of feeling framed by someone else's expectations. Professionally, I redirected the extra hours I once poured into appeasing Lauren into building a small side consulting branch of my IT work. I reached out to former clients, offered specialized support packages, and within months it added $18,000 to my annual income. The number mattered less than the principle behind it. I was investing in myself because it made sense, not because I was trying to compete with some imaginary lineup of more ambitious husbands. More importantly than the gym, the camera, or the income, I rediscovered peace. Evenings in my apartment were quiet in a way that no longer felt hollow. I cooked simple meals without wondering if they looked impressive enough. I read. I slept through the night. Therapy helped me untangle the part of myself that equated love with constant performance. I began to understand that partnership should not require auditioning. Lauren, from what I learned through scheduled logistical conversations and the occasional therapy update, was also changing. She distanced herself from Madison, not dramatically, but gradually, setting boundaries that would have seemed impossible months earlier. She picked up a second job to stabilize her finances after realizing how precarious her lifestyle had become. She stayed in therapy consistently. The defensiveness in her tone during our necessary calls softened over time, replaced with accountability that felt less rehearsed and more internalized. When October arrived and our 6-month separation concluded, we agreed to meet at White Rock Lake, the same place I had spent mornings photographing sunrise. The air was cooler, carrying the first hint of fall, and the water was calm. When she approached, I noticed we were not the same people who had sat across from each other in that Addison coffee shop. There was less tension in my shoulders, less urgency in her movements. We spoke openly about the months apart, about patterns we had identified, about fears we had confronted alone. We did not rush back into the version of marriage we had before. We chose to try again, but slowly and deliberately. We kept separate apartments at first. We committed to couples counseling alongside our individual therapy. We set boundaries around communication, finances, and extended family influence. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic promises, only structured effort and honesty. It has been a year now. We share a smaller apartment near the lake, intentionally simpler than the one we once had in Plano. The decor is practical rather than curated. Our routines are quieter. Conversations are clearer because they are no longer layered with unspoken resentment. We check in instead of assuming. We correct small issues before they become quiet narratives. Here is the truth I understand now, one that took a storm and a recording to reveal. The marriage survived because I was finally willing to let it die. The moment I stopped clinging to it out of fear was the moment it had space to either collapse or rebuild on healthier ground. Silence did not punish her. It protected me. It created the boundary I should have established long before resentment turned into mockery. And once I stopped begging to be valued, once I removed myself from the role of constant contender for her approval, she finally understood what my presence actually meant. Not as a cage. Not as a background character. But as a choice.